The numbness in both of my hands was not a surprise. They'd been torn open and frozen shut to a point of paralysis. At least it felt like that. My legs were still working, though, and it was hard to discern how. I moaned and grunted a little when I peeled my masked nose from the ground. Ahead of me was a road with tire tracks carving up into the hill. They were days old by the looks of them. I could see that despite the hard freeze, there was something of a residual trail of soot from faulty emissions. I surmised the vehicle to be a logger or a snowplow from the deep tracks. From here I could see that the tracks kept going all the way up the mountain. I was sure that this was the old back road to Rogerton, but it seemed different from before. Wiping the night's snow off the closest sign, I moved my fingers over the writing. Private property, keep out. An even rougher journey lay ahead. The uncertainty of what came next made me shudder and over-speculate as it often did. The inexorable movement of every working part, the complexity, the raw strength of the world felt like it would collapse around my head. But I'd suffered this far, and I couldn't bear my cross just to give it up 200 or 300 feet from the finish line. What killed me was the timing of everything, the sequencing of the events, like a recipe to test my endurance. Underneath that was an even deeper fear, an intuition. Something bothered me past any of the frostbitten wounds and the lacerations covering my body. It was offsetting. A nerve was being pricked by something in my mind. The image of the dead bandits hit me in waves, like a fast-moving slideshow. Beams from an oncoming vehicle leapt out and pinpointed me on the side of the road. I jumped back a couple paces at the motion and loud noise. Feeling more alien than familial, I distanced myself, moving back a ways into the trees on the ridge. I tried to catch a look at the driver, but the headlights burned through my vision. It couldn't be that I fell asleep in the snow next to an approaching stranger, because that would be ridiculous. But upon waking up, the scene told a very different story, one that bore repeating. It was nestled in the back seat of a truck, where I found myself stretched out, sock-footed and completely thawed. The interest in my own physical condition was left for the curious silhouette in the driver's seat, a ball cap, a bad haircut, and some beat-up work gloves. These were the descriptors of his character and partially his story. They met me right off, and I began to wonder who it was that had seen fit to drag me out of the snow to safety. Probably just a truck driver, but I thought about the past days and the people I'd seen. I stretched out over his shoulder a bit to catch a look at the road past his dash ornaments. The lights gave way, the disguise of safety, and I could tell immediately that we'd reached town. "You gonna be all right?" came from the front. I raised up and brought myself between the seats. I don't think all right would quite describe it, but yeah. He braked at a stop sign and offered me a smoke. I obliged and lit my first since the woods. A deep, gnawing headache beat at me, till I curled up again in the comfort of the back seat. The nicotine calmed me some, but it wasn't a good fix. I laid my head on the leather upholstery and blinked my tired eyes, trying to think of something that would take my mind off the strangeness of my situation. "If you want," he said, "you can stay back there until morning." I grunted a little and looked up at the fellow with his week-old beard and radio. "Thanks." So I nodded off again, quite tired from my battle in the woods. It hadn't occurred to me that I might be in any kind of danger. In fact, there was a pretty clear drop-off from the perils of the wilderness to whatever dangers I faced here. It hadn't felt this way an hour ago, but I found myself reassured by a return to civilization. It was like I was in a quarrel with modernity. The bland architecture, the cold lifelessness of man-made furnishing left me nauseous and sent me reeling back in renewed appreciation of the wilderness. Some hours must have passed between this and the fiery sunrise with which I was greeted next. The perspective was through a dirty windshield. I wiped my eyes and sat up with more energy than I'd had in days. I began to recollect the events of the previous night, no matter how dark or introspective. Without much trial, I started to cycle through those events like coats on a rack. Then I found something. It startled me. I smacked my lips and breathed heavily for a few seconds. The hint of tobacco still lingered, but there was something else I couldn't identify. A passing undertone to the mix of bad flavors already present. It worried me, and suddenly I began to think that I'd been poisoned the night before. All evidence pointed to the cigarette. When I'd cleared my head and got up from the back seat and climbed over the column to the driver's side, I looked around some to see where I was and was met with stares from the townsfolk across the street. An old man sat drinking at the storefront. He looked at me with a suspicious gaze, eyed the rest of the cars, and then resumed his boozing. With that, I opened the driver's door and got down onto the curb. The smell of town life was different. The odors were less active. They were dull and gentrified as nature crossbred with man-made jungle. Turning around, I caught a look at myself in the nearest window. The clothes looked dirty and ripped. It was here that I noticed the bandaging on my hands. It was wrapped neatly the way a physician might, with care and attention given to the comfort of the patient. When I was done admiring the dressed wounds, I found my way to the bar over off the street corner. The barkeep looked to be opening the place just then. I set both hands on the glass at the store front, leaning in with silent inquiry. He kept his eyes on me as he passed through the room with pen and rag. An almost spiteful glare came from his eyes when he reached the back of the room. He didn't like me being there, especially since the sign on the door said, "Closed." It was at this juncture that he decided to move out and get a closer look at me. He came out with a steady pace so as to evoke a kind of fortitude. Someone who'd spent his days around many rough folk from all over the world. The front door swung open, followed by a stone-faced barkeep. He forced the door the rest of the way shut and tucked the keys away in his pocket. "Bar don't open till 10 o'clock. I stayed where I was so as not to make myself a threat. "I'm not here to drink. I'm here looking for a man named Brian Thatcher. We're close friends. I'm supposed to meet him in town." "Okay," he said. "What's this man look like?" "Oh, tall, gray hair. Walks like a cowboy. You might have seen him ride a horse into town." The bartender seemed taken aback by this. He paused to look downward as if to collect his thoughts. Something was formulating, but it took its time. Finally, the fellow raised his eyes and we connected again, this time for what I hoped to be an answer to my all-important question. "I think I know the man you mean. Is he kind of scroungy looking too?" "A good month-old beard. He carries a long rifle for moose hunting." The barkeep lit his cigarette and walked a few paces closer. "I seen someone matching that description come down through here last night, real late, but he wasn't on a horse." I looked at him a little bewildered. "His story was he got jumped by a band of outlaws on that hunting property south of here. Said they pretty near skinned him and that girl alive, but he escaped and took her with him." "He stopped in the bar?" I asked. I looked even more disturbed than previously. "Yeah, for a while. I think they've got the girl held up somewhere. She's gonna live, but they think she knows something about the crash." "Crash?" "Yep. Flight 318 bound for Toronto. I guess somewhere close to 100 souls on board, dead. Say, where did you come from, buddy? You one of those loggers that lives out of his truck?" "I guess right now all I am is a hungry man. You got a good place to eat around here?" "Hell, mister, come on into the bar. I'll get you a sandwich and a cup of coffee." "Thank you, that'd be nice." Following this, the events changed pace and direction. I didn't know what to do next, and I didn't care what happened, so long as I got back safely to Maggie. The promise of deliverance was circumstantial, just like everything else. The notions of my own culpability faded as I bellied up to the bar and shed my coat for a bite to eat. My eyes started to twitch as I followed the barkeep, watching his swift preparation. Tossing the bar towel over his shoulder, he leaned in for what I anticipated to be a question. "How do you want your coffee?" "Black is fine." So he poured me the fresh cup of coffee from the steaming pot. I sipped at it carefully, still suspicious of foul play from before. When my paranoia was relaxed, I made it my business to glance around the room at various portraits and collector's signs hanging off the walls. The mood was lighter than before, but even as he carved a loaf of bread and sliced the cheese, I was reminded in grim and horrific detail the events in the woods. Not to be controlled by these visions, I wiped my eyes in a subtle attempt to push them back. Before too long, the food was ready. The plate slid across the bar to me. I barely moved, only raising my eyes to the barkeep. He seemed to know intuitively what I was feeling, but I wasn't about to open up just yet. It was high time I got something in my stomach, so I indulged. "Where are you from?" I replied when the first bite was swallowed. "Montana, for 8 years. Since then, I've been all over." Not to be evaded, he pulled up a stool from behind the bar and looked more intensely at me. "Them bandages look fresh." I stopped somewhat dramatically. "They are. Did you want to know about 'em?" He leaned back leisurely at this. "I ain't trying to nose into your business, just wondering is all." The slightly off-put air to this last statement made me worry once again. "I believe that," I began. "People here got a knack for digging around in other people's businesses." "How's that?" "I said people around here ask too many questions." He gave me a funny look. "You been around here long? 'Cause I ain't seen you in Rogerton before." "I usually stick to the motel when I'm here." "That's so." "Yes, it is." We both stayed quiet for a while. I finished my sandwich, and he topped off the coffee before I could ask. Something was eating at me, an idea. I scooted back in my seat, gripping the edge of the bar with what little dexterity remained in my hands and wrists. The tension hung in the room like a fog, both of us too polite to ruin the staging of the sun as it pierced through the storefront. I looked out at it, chewing on my last bite of the meal. Dust particles were drifting through the room like faraway solar systems in the night sky. I felt the warmth of the light as it moved out from the shelter of the clouds. In the distance, a man emerged from the alley by the department store. A hood concealed his face, but there was a familiarity to his stride. He met with the old rummy across the street corner, and they shook hands like college mates. The hooded fellow looked like he knew his way around and didn't seem to observe much of the deadness of the streets. The way he walked, it could have been a sidewalk in the middle of Times Square or a market in Hong Kong. The irreverent freeness with which he conducted himself to exude something which I had not seen in some time. The smart, deliberate actions were in themselves a language. It came of this that I found myself staring quite rudely out at him. He adjusted his gaze to the storefront and caught my lingering eyes. I turned back to the bar and the half-empty mug, not wanting him to notice. But I looked up again to see him moving across the street in our direction. The barkeep looked to me. "You know him?" "I'm not sure," I replied. "That's a fella I was telling you about." "What fella?" I asked. "The one who was talking about the mess south of here. You know, with the plane crash." I looked back to the approaching figure, then to the bartender. "That's not my friend," I said. He seemed surprised. "That's not Brian Thatcher," I said. Chapter 11. My fear was to look closer, letting the eyes rest upon contact, not averting from the shadowy form that stirred me up. But I mustered the courage and looked at the man when he came into the storefront, eyes piercing through the glass in my direction. It wasn't the idea of him coming in that bothered me. It was the thought of my own deeds which kept lashing me like a whip, bleeding my veins. I thought if I just ran for it, I could make my way to the town doctor and check in on the girl. But the tender knees and back wouldn't allow this. Leaning forward, I blew on the coffee, signaling the barkeep for a cigarette. I lit up just as the phantom man seated himself at the bar. Hiding my eyes, I could feel his stare as it swept over me to the bartender and back around to the collector's posters I'd taken notice of before. I barely drew on the cigarette, too anxious to think about appearances. Then this man spoke. "I want a chicken fried steak with your grits, glass of water, no lemon, please." The bartender came back. "It'll be a bit of a wait on that. My cook ain't in yet." The man scratched at his neck and groaned like a dog. When is he going to be back?" "Just sit tight," said the bartender. "We've got sandwiches, and I just brewed a fresh pot of coffee." "I don't want your goddamn coffee or your goddamn sandwiches." This roused me from my antisocial stupor. I looked out past my arm at the cranky character sitting on my left. He took notice and gave me a bad look. "Who's this?" The bartender hesitated. "Dan," I piped up. "Good to meet you." "Where did you come from, Dan?" The question was placed with just enough vagueness as to not arouse suspicion, but with just enough imposed intimacy to make me uncomfortable. "Around. There's a whole lot of places around here, so you're going to have to be a little bit more specific." Now I was pissed off. "I don't know who you think I am, but whoever it is, I'm not him. I'm tired, I'm beat down, and I'm cold." The room fell silent. I felt around on my belt for the .45 Brian had lent me. It was still there, but I had very limited confidence as to whether I could clear it without some kind of mishap. But then something else got my attention, something I hadn't noticed before. There was an emblem on the sleeve of the man's coat. It bore a resemblance to those worn by airline stewards on board the wreckage. The images came back in snapshots, freezing me in the terror of the moment. I looked back up at him, and he met my stare with a sullen, wretched face. He scooted his chair out away from the bar a couple of inches. The barkeep looked nervous. "I don't like you," he growled after some seconds. "It ain't my fault," I came back. The sinister tone in the room had been raised to a fever pitch. There were a few outside observers looking in through the glass to our little standoff. I suddenly realized that the exhibit we were making of ourselves, and thus acknowledging, made it my duty to diffuse it for the moment. I walked towards the man, palms open, maintaining strict eye contact and taking care to give him breathing room. "Listen, you're upset," I started. "You don't have to explain it to me, 'cause I get it. I know this world's a rough place. Hell, I'm probably as upset about it as you are." His eyes wandered around, looking me square in the face, and then shifting to my coat, and then my belt. "You got a piece on you?" "That's for the mountain lions. I camp a lot, you know. Out there." "Out there, huh? You see that plane crash 2 nights ago?" I was reticent to say anything for fear that I might show my hand. "I heard it." The fellow turned again to the barkeep, sliding a suspicious glare that proved his discontentment with my answer. "What did you hear?" My patience had eroded away. I snapped, clearing the .45 from my belt into the man's cheek, where it pressed firmly enough to give an impression. "A lot. Okay, I heard a lot. I did a lot. What's that mean to you?" His eye contact was steady now, stout and full of a newly acquired fear. I felt the impulse to reenact the violence from the woods here, a temptation which, although disturbing, had built its way into the framework of my emotions. The tense way in which he held himself after being destroyed by a far angrier man, seized up features bowing to new authority. It was sublime. Here I felt as if I could change anything and enlighten the silly man on his knees in front of me. But this feeling passed, and I got tired. I moved the weapon away from his face, replacing it to my belt where it belonged. The barkeep was frozen like a statue, plate in one hand and towel in the other. "You're a psycho!" the man let out as he fled the bar. I took my seat again, taking notice that the small audience had dispersed. The barkeep leaned in towards me. "What was that?" I couldn't think of an answer that wouldn't arouse more suspicion than had already been stirred, so I moved to pay for my breakfast in the usual way. He was more stressed now. "You hearing me? What was that? You draw your pistol in my bar and point it at one of my oldest customers?" "He was an asshole," I came back. "I don't care what he was. You're leaving now. Get the hell out." Now the bartender had a pistol-grip shotgun resting on his shoulder. "You hear me? Out. Now." "Maybe he's your customer," I said, "but in my world he's a scumbag and an accomplice to murder and rape." The bartender maintained his composure and posed a question after some thought. "How do I know you aren't the criminal and trying to place blame on him?" This astonished me. I concentrated on forming a civil response. "I've passed through here many a time with my face hiding behind a ski mask and a hood. I slept in your motel. I ate your food. I know the owner there. You can talk to him if you like." Then I saw through the veneer and into the building hostility in his heart. The bartender had made up his mind about me, and it didn't matter how much sense I made or how vehemently I howled about my innocence. The jury was out in his mind. "But you don't care, do you?" I asked. The barkeep moved the barrel of his shotgun in alignment with my belly. I looked down at it and back to him. He backed up a couple steps into the drink counter, unsteady and unsure of what to do other than run me out. "I'll leave," I said, taking my hat. When I got to the door, I raised my eyes to the dirty streets, all marked up and down with tire tracks and littered with trash. The old rummy across the street gave me a look. Not the kind that you catch from a simple stranger on a typical day, but more along the variety of a man entrenched in a deep and impenetrable sorrow. He'd seen some of the commotion, and I assumed that, being friends with the man I'd quarreled with, he'd been led to believe that I was a criminal. Suddenly, everyone's faces became like vicious caricatures plastered on human bodies. I walked a ways further and saw that even the children had stopped their frolicking in the snow. Just down the street corner and to the park, there could be seen children bundled up like Eskimos, stopped and petrified at my very image. With every step outward, it felt more as if I was walking to my own crucifixion. I hurried my steps then, not wanting to make anything more of this than had already been made. A look up to the sky showed a very refreshing sight. The sun was in clear view, beating down on everything and everyone, assuring that the snow would be soft until evening time. Then something struck me as I was approaching the hill that led up into Midtown. There was a horse tied to a post further up the road. It was out by the storefront, where I knew the druggist to be. I quickened my pace even more, jumping up through the wet snow towards this sight. The closer I got, the more it looked like Brian's mare. She even had the same markings and the same old saddlebag he'd had for years. Closing in, I tried to contain myself. The thought of finality to this whole thing was delicious. I was beat down and tired beyond common words. A joy fell over me when I planted my face on the mare's neck. I gave her a good hug and scratching and stepped up on the walkway that stretched the length of Midtown. The inside of the drugstore was black except for one conspicuous light glowing in the back room where the proprietor stored his cigars and liquor. I moved closer to the door and grabbed hold of the handle. It turned and swung open, unmasking the smoky room with shelves and shelves of labeled bottles and mason jars. The furthest corner of the room was joined to the foyer by a small corridor, which was lined with encyclopedias, journals, and a kind of isolated section for pharmaceutical books. The inside smelled like old books and plant fragrance. The scent of burning wood hung in the air, but the actual feeling of the room was cooler than expected. Not like outside, but not the cozy temperature associated with such places. When I'd begun to feel safe enough, I moved through the front room into the corridor, eyeing the titles and authorship from a few of his books on the lower shelf. Just then it occurred to me to lock the door behind me. I rushed back and bolted it shut tightly. Then, walking softly back to the lounge area, I searched around for any signs of the druggist. Then, quite by accident, I ran upon a clump of mud on the floor. There was nothing special about the clump, as clumps of mud go, but there proved to be more, and in fact a reliable trail leading from the front counter and over to the stock room. There was another trail, a bit smaller, made distinct by the shape of the indentation. I reached down to examine it when a sound came from underneath the floorboards. I sank back into a darker corner of the stock room, drawing the .45 instinctively and aiming in the direction from which the sound had come. It shouldn't surprise anyone to see a man climbing through a hatch from his cellar, but it did me. I'd been suspicious of nearly every movement and noise since that scene at the wreckage. hardly knew what to think about it all. A warm lamplight emanated from the cellar as the balding gentleman mounted the rest of the stairs and pulled himself up onto the stockroom floor. To be sure, it was the druggist, although more crazed and forlorn in appearance than the last time I'd spoken to him. He brushed his vest and trousers off, reaching inside a pocket for something. This was when he stopped, acutely aware that there was someone else in the room. He straightened his back and looked intensely through the shroud of black in my direction. "Well, have a cup of coffee and thaw out." It worried me a little that he'd spotted me this quick. I stepped out into the light, replacing my weapon behind my coat. "I've had coffee." The gentleman leaned in a little to the side to see past some of his instruments to the front door. "If you are looking for Brian, he is not here. He left at 5 o'clock for some business." I moved out into the room and took a seat on one of his stock barrels. "That's fine. I came to see the girl." He looked perplexed. "That is a bit of a problem." "How's that?" I asked. "She's in a coma. She won't be able to talk to anyone for, until she comes out of it." Feeling the tension, I reached slowly into my coat pocket for the tobacco pouch. The druggist eyed it as I opened the top and sifted through a bit of the product. "Brian gave you that?" "He did." The man took a second and then rebounded. "Either his plan was to kill you or save your life. It's difficult to tell which." He took the pouch from me and placed it on his work counter. "This is laced with PCP. I glared at him, shifting my eyes all around the room in silence. "Absorption of the drug can cause hallucinations. Sometimes lasts hours. I had those hallucinations out there when I was walking back. I only remember some bits and pieces, but it was enough to lay me out for a while." The druggist approached, looking at the condition of my clothes and the bandages on both hands. He took one hand in his own and examined the quality of the wrappings. "How did you get back to town?" he asked. "By foot." "And the bandaging? Did you do this?" "I had a little help. A good Samaritan found me on the outer road and drove me into town." "A good Samaritan." There was a new suspicion in his tone. "Those are scarce around here." "What did he drive?" "A big truck, logger of some kind." The druggist backed away a couple steps and looked at his wristwatch. "Did he have a name?" "I didn't ask." Now he looked indignant, almost mad. "Well, help me to understand this. You're saying that a man stopped for you, a complete stranger with a loaded weapon, and he took you into his workshop, bandaged you, and drove you back to the safety of this town?" "Yes," I said. I was too delirious to notice much about him. He looked like an average working man to me. The druggist sighed and moved out towards the cigar lounge in the back of his shop. I followed closely behind, clinging to each move, eager for some explanation. He tilted his glasses, grunting with age as he climbed the old stepladder by the bookcase. "We have spoken about this, but I think I should remind you that the law around here is not to be trusted. They're crooked, a lot of them, pushing drugs through other provinces to cover their trail." The druggist withdrew an old book from a corner of the shelf, thumbing through the introduction for some bit of information. His eyes lit up, and he took out a booklet about the size of a common magazine. He reached down and handed it to me, groaning and struggling as he stepped back down the ladder. "These are newspaper clippings from 30 years ago," I said. "All you need to know about the history of this town is bound to the pages of that album. Where it came from, who bought it, who lives here, and who the current owners are." I snapped the album shut when he said this. A daunting fear came over me, like the kind in the woods when the men were encroaching on my camp. All at once, I felt that the world and everything inside it was pushing me near the edge of a cliff. I clenched my fists and looked to the front door again. The handle was turning and squeaking. "It's locked tight," said the druggist. "Whoever that is can knock himself out." Not so sure of the security of his locks, I eased back into the corridor. I was tense and anxious. The fear dominated my composure until I found myself cowering in the corner by the bookcase, gun readied. The druggist had disappeared, and I half expected that he was the wiser for doing so. I waited, crouched, and loaded for whatever form came through that doorway. The handle turned again, this time budging the door slightly open, allowing bright shafts of the late morning sun to drift into the room. I concentrated. "I'm coming inside. Don't shoot me," a voice bellowed out. I squeezed the gun tighter than before. "Go ahead," I said. Then a strong hand reached around the edge of the door, pushing it the rest of the way open. It was the truck driver. He looked the same as before, yet different in many subtle ways. He was no longer wearing the dirt-stained clothes of a small-town lumber worker. "Long time," he grumbled. "That's what has me worrying," I said. "It's only been a few hours." "You're all messed up, aren't you?" he asked. "The doc probably has something that could help." Marching over to the druggist's desk in a familiar manner, with a little effort and rapacity, he gained access to the top drawer, which, to my surprise, was stocked to the brim with bags of cannabis. The smell that followed this was overpowering and nauseating, like the stench of a ripened skunk corpse. "You didn't really think he was making it out here selling pain pills, did you?" he chuckled. "New world, baby. Things are getting hard. Takes a higher class of pharmacists to recognize that and administer the cure." He paused here. "Ain't that right, Doc?" The man shoved the drawer shut with his knee and walked around to face me, his outline silhouetted in the dust light. I don't blame him. Do you? I chose not to reply or acknowledge his monologue. A man has to pay bills, feed himself, feed his family. Finally, I thought of something that would lift us out of this web of introductory and situational confusion. "I killed 5 men yesterday." The energy in the room loosened for an instant between the tail of his sentence and the beginning of mine, but regained its tension shortly after, pushing us into yet another standoff. "You did," he said matter-of-factly. "Yes, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. So if you're finished, I'd like to get right to the point on this. The reason you're here, the reason why I'm here, and why the old man is hiding down there from you and not from me." "Sure," he said. "Nothing happens without an applied force," I began. "Events do not unfold themselves, they unravel through stimulus. So, men with guns don't just appear out in the reservoir. Alright, something put them out there." I removed the envelope from my coat and slapped it impatiently on the table. "This is what we're dealing with," I said. leaning over even closer to look him in the eyes. "The blood I spilled and the pain I endured out there cannot be undone, sir. It can't be put back." An inhospitable look emanated from him here. I knew I had struck some kind of chord. He leaned in at me just a bit, gripping the chair handle behind him until his fingers whitened. "I know," he spit. "You think you're special, little man? Want me to give you a medal for bravery?" I didn't know what to say to this, so I just stood my ground. He scooped up the envelope and unfolded the contents in my face. "This here is just the beginning. Just a shred of the whole truth, man. I've been studying them for 2 decades, and I have seen things that would make your eyeballs sink back into your skull. I know things that would drive most men crazy. You understand?" "What do you mean, them?" I asked. "Them," he shouted. "The enemy." He was pointing his index finger along the part of the paragraph mentioning government agencies and bureaucracies. "These people run everything. You innately know this, but you've been programmed away from believing it." He paced around a couple seconds and came back with the note crumpled in one fist. "Alright, we're at a devastating moment in history, man. They knew we wouldn't give up our freedoms if they came and took them from us like bad guys in movies. What most people don't understand is that's not how true evil operates. Okay, it takes hold and it grows from the weakest points in an individual and a society and shapes it into an image. Like a weed choking out a fruit. It starts from below and it poisons slowly. You understand? Slowly." I stood silent. It wasn't that the words bothered me, since I had a basic understanding of these things. It was more an anxiety stemming from the fact that I didn't know what would come out of his mouth next. He seemed deeply tied to whatever machinations had delivered those bandit souls from the mountains. With all of this information pouring out, I felt it was time to learn the rest of the story as soon as possible. "I want to know what's going on, and not in the form of cryptic language, okay?" He uncrumpled the paper into my hand and spoke. "Well, you earned that right, I guess," he said. "Take a look." Following this, he pulled down the curtain that was covering the street-facing window. Then he stepped back a little and motioned for me to approach. "This picture's worth 1,000 words," he said, as I strolled in towards the newly cast light. Leaning in, peering, I beheld a crowd of people gathering in the street outside, all of whom seemed to be staring in at us. It made me regretful that I had ever thought of entering the building at daylight. With town gossip being what it was, I should have known better than to walk around so conspicuously. "What are they doing?" I asked. "They're looking at you." "I know," I said, "but why are they standing around like that? It's weird." "You got a reputation from some of the stories they told about you." "In the bar?" I said. "Uh-huh. They heard about your killing. I don't just walk around killing people, okay? That little demon in the bar was feeding them lies about me." "I know," he said. "I was there." I turned to him a little bothered by this. "And you let them slander me?" "I kept to myself, that's right." "Well, I feel like I owe them an explanation. I better go out there and, He stopped me short with his arm. You walk out there, you'd have to kill a dozen more. I don't think you want that to happen, Danny boy."